Well, thank you very much for having a chance to join you, and I really want to first extend a special thanks to Rob and Biniam, who gave us the chance to join you here today, but also, have really been the people we've had a chance to work with in trying to build a stronger partnership amongst those who are funding this space, because that's not always easy. So it really takes, it's always at the personal level, and we've really appreciated their engagement in the forum, but also our chance to engage with you, and we hope that's something we can continue to do going forward. I don't have a PowerPoint because I'm what's called a recovering PowerPoint addict. And I'll give you, very briefly, I'll tell you when I realized my PowerPoint addiction had hit the point where I had to do something about it, and there was an intervention. And it was when I was in Yemen some years back, obviously before the Syria situation there now, and I was doing a presentation in Sana'a on rural development strategy with the government, and there were Minister of Planning, Minister of Ag, Minister of Social Development, et cetera. And while we were there was a very tragic bombing by Al-Qaeda at a hospital about a block away from the hotel. And they're very cool, the Yemenis, and the room shook, dust falling down, the noise, et cetera. They just continued. They didn't miss a beat. They were quite brave. And then there was the chance to do the PowerPoint, and so I had to do the PowerPoint. And I was doing it, and there was a young colleague there who was sort of pushing the clicker. And we were hearing grenades and automatic rifle fire, and we were looking at each other, and we just kept going and going and going. And this guy's eyes got bigger and bigger, like, it's 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, and we're still hearing this. And at the end of it, he confronted me and said, "You're insane. You're willing to go through an Al-Qaeda attack just to get your PowerPoint presented." And he said, "You really need help." And so I'm in the withdrawal phase right now, so bear with me. And I love PowerPoints. I think they make it much more interesting for the audience. But please bear with me and help me through this moment of transition. Then maybe I'll come back to it. But as was mentioned a number of times, we're coming off. I think this is a continuation of a discussion that really, in many ways, at least for us, started with our partners in developing the forum, the University of Nebraska, the Dauchi Center for Water for Food. And then we were there, and there was a presentation of actually this program, and we just found it fantastic. And so we reached out to Rob and Biniam from USAID, Chris from USDA, and we said, let's try and do something in DC around this issue, because it's just so important, and there's a real need for more to raise the discussion. And we can use the Washington platform as a way to bring in a broader set of actors, and particularly actors from many of the countries you're from and that area. And so that's sort of how it happened. And I think it was really exciting because we had over 250 people through most of the conference, which is not easy. I was amazed. Some people said the food was pretty good, and that was why. But I think it was a little more than that. I think people are excited about it, and as Peter was saying, Peter McCormick was saying, we didn't even get a chance to say goodbye because there was so much energy coming out at the end where people were still connecting and making new links, whether it's amongst the different sectors and parts of the world. So I think in that sense it was very good, and we're also really grateful to the colleagues from IFPRI and EMI who were very much involved in organizing it and provided some very good content. The focus of the event, we took a different approach. We said we're going to do something different because there are opportunities like this for us to talk to each other, and by that I mean within the international community, and of course most importantly our colleagues from governments. But we said let's try and get some complementary voices, and so we really made a particular effort to have representatives of farmer organizations, but also from the private sector, both the technology suppliers as well as the food companies that are off-takers, and try and have them sort of provide a reality check on what this is all about. And I think that was, at least for myself, what added a lot to a value, because it did bring it highlighted some different voices that weren't inconsistent, but sort of challenged us in some new ways, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Just real quickly, why the term farmer-led? I think Rob did just a fantastic job of laying the context for why this type of irrigation is important, why this type of irrigation is particularly exciting. So I won't go there, but let me go a little bit into the definitions or the vocabulary, because it matters. Because I notice one of the struggles we're having in this space is getting enough of a common vocabulary that we don't sort of inadvertently start going back into talking about irrigation in general, or large-scale irrigation, the advantages of it versus that. So I think if we come out with nothing less than just a better sense of a common vocabulary, that'll be helpful. So let me throw a few of the terms that we've been working on together, coming out of, again, many years of work that you've all been involved with, and that now we're joining you with others on. First is this term farmer-led, because there's small-scale irrigation, there's distributed irrigation, there's private irrigation, and it goes on and on. I think we collectively thought farmer-led was a good way to go, because it really is about farmers choosing the technology and then being responsible for the operation and maintenance, which are two of the big problems we have with the big irrigation schemes, which do some great things, as we all emphasized. But the O&M story, I don't think I have to repeat it to all of you. It's a real challenge. So in essence, farmer-led irrigation privatizes the selection of technologies and the responsibility for O&M with the farmer themselves. And that's important, and we think that sets the incentives in the right place. Water user associations are meant to do that. Sometimes they work. I think many of you know the literature. It's a mixed story. Maybe the best thing out there in large scale, but it's not as consistently performing as often what we see when people go out, buy their own equipment and pumps and water distribution and application equipment. Second is the idea of private sector driven. And by that we mean, and I know farmers are part of the private sector, I don't want to get into that part of it, but when we say private sector, we're talking about the commercial tech providers, the companies that are out there, everything from the IDEs to the Netafims to the Valmonts, et cetera. Everybody who's out there providing equipment. So they're the ones who are putting the money into a lot of the applied R&D. They're developing the products. They're setting up the distribution networks, supply chains of irrigation equipment that Rob made reference to, and that's on them. And as opposed to, again, putting it on the public sector, and so this is, and also the financing side, which Peter highlighted yesterday, which we didn't get as much into, but it's either dealer financing or sometimes microfinance, or again, farmers right out of their pockets. And so, again, we've shifted a lot of the things that we tried to do with some success, but a lot of failure, onto the private side, with hopefully better incentives. And then the last part, which is not unimportant, is still the role of the public sector. So we say publicly supported. And that is the appropriate public sector role, which is not necessarily to choose the technology or do the O&M, not necessarily to decide what equipment is the right equipment and then provide it, or to maintain it. It's really to try and deal with those societal issues that, as we say, are market failures in terms of taking more of a privatized approach. And the two that we, really focused on in the context of the conference, and I see as also part of the work that you're all doing, is first of all the inclusive supply chain aspect. Some people will have difficulty engaging with these supply chains, either because they're poor, they're isolated, perhaps the technology opportunities are such that they don't work for women in terms of the type of equipment. Perhaps the need to access finance doesn't work for young people because they don't have a track record or land holdings that they can show. So how do we make those groups able to access these technologies? And there we feel there's an absolutely appropriate public role, but doing it in a way that doesn't displace the private sector. So it's about vouchers or microfinance guarantees, things like that, as opposed to the government buying a bunch of pumps and distributing them, for instance. I mean, and there's some stories around that, but you know those. So that's one. And the other one is, of course, which has been highlighted, is the resource sustainability side. When when the government's running it, in principle, they can manage the resource aspect. But once you go to private sector or individual private sector, the farmer-led, suddenly you've got a bunch of farmers, drilling boreholes, pumping water, with absolutely no particular reason for them to constrain themselves on an individual basis. It's the tragedy of the commons, first in, first out, and good luck to the rest of us. And so how government does, we believe, and I think we've seen it, have a role in helping farmers and other users come together to say, how can we manage this resource more sustainably? And so again, it's farmer-led, private sector-driven, publicly supported. So those are three vocabulary things I'll just throw out there, and let's see if those stick or if there's some better ones. Another quick sort of thing that came out of the conference, and again, most people were there, but I'm just trying to bring us back to some that really stood out, at least for me. One was Tushar Shah yesterday from EMI gave a very nice presentation, and it was on the collective action side, but first he showed us some research, and you may be looking at it more later today, on the why this is working, why it's spreading so fast. And I mean, the one that just stands out is he showed 4 types of farming systems, rain-fed, flood irrigation, something else, and then pump irrigation. And he showed that the research he was involved with, $300 per year for a small farmer across 3 of them. And then when he got to the pump irrigation, it jumps to $1,000 a year. I mean, what other argument do you need? We'll continue to do the research as will everyone else, but frankly, that's what's driving it. People are making more money when they do this. So I think that was a really exciting and important result that we saw, because we always sort of feel intuitively this is working. The market sort of tells us it is, because people are going out there and buying this with their own money. But that research sort of confirmed that's a pretty exciting result. So some key messages that came from listening to this diverse group of participants. 2 that really stood out for me, and I mentioned them yesterday afternoon, but I'll just repeat them again, not because they're the most important ones, but again, they're the ones that really struck me. And in some sense, I guess I'm trying to make sure that we at the World Bank hold ourselves accountable for this and bring that as part of the work we do together with other partners. But the first was do it differently. And we heard that from 2 perspectives. We heard it from the farmers who said, if you only work through governments, and this is farmer-led, this doesn't make sense to us. You have to find a way to work with us more consistently and more directly. We all, of course, work and do consultations with farmer groups and the beneficiaries of projects, but their point is it needs to be much more direct, and I thought that was a fair challenge. The private sector also said you need to do it differently. That may not apply as much to USAID, but certainly to the World Bank, African Development Bank, IFAD, and others, is they said you need to procure differently. Your procurement is around equipment with specs that may be outdated, et cetera. Do it results-based. And we have some experience with that. MCC shared some of that experience with us. But their point is come up with the results that you're looking for, and that goes to some of the things that Rob mentioned earlier about more integrated packages, because many of these companies have the capacity to not just provide the technology, but also turnkey type operations that include after-sales service and even assistance on things like inputs and marketing and other things. And they have experience. They're not bringing it to at least the projects we often work with because we're not asking for it. So they're saying you need a way to ask for it and provide the incentives for that. And there seems to be some experience out there. So we're going to try and harvest some of that experience and see what will it take for an organization like ours working with others who have similar challenges in terms of how we operate to respond to that. The second big sort of message that I heard coming to us was build on what's already there. Our colleagues from NAPAD and CADUP made this very clearly in the African context, from Native CADUP and AGRA, and they said we have things are already going. It's there. And again, many of you in this room are examples of that. You know what's going on there. They said don't try and reinvent. Find the things that seem to be working that you think you can support and build on that, whether it's about technology, whether it's about supply chain development, et cetera. And again, seem like very common sense points, but those are things that I think we often have to keep reminding ourselves of. Very quickly, what are we as the World Bank doing in this space? We have many programs that are supplying pumps through what we call community-driven development, or sort of where there's a menu of options and the farmers can choose, and they often choose pumps or drip systems or micro sprinkler systems, et cetera. The Fatima program in Nigeria, many people know about. I mean, last count, I think we're over 1 million, sort of pump set irrigations have been supported. So that's a lot. At the same time, they're very partial. They tend to focus, just get the equipment to the farmer. So more recently, we are working with 6 African countries in the context of SILS, which is an organization that works across 13 countries in the Sahel. It's one of the sub-regional organizations in Africa. I think most of you are aware of it. And that's really, it's called the Sahel Irrigation Initiative, and it's really based on the idea of helping the countries to work together in terms of the learning, because what happens in Nigeria, it doesn't always get shared as it needs to in Mauritania, or what happens in Senegal with Burkina Faso and vice versa, as well as bringing international experience. So SILS is meant to be the knowledge node and the technical assistance node, but then each country will, of course, develop their own approaches. But what's really key is it provides a very consistent, across the countries, framework for thinking through their irrigation investment strategies. Everything from the farmer-led individual irrigation all the way up to the very large-scale irrigation and private PPP, large-scale commercial PPPs. So it basically helps the countries to say, these are the different options, these are the issues that underlie the advantages and disadvantages of those options and where they make sense. And then based on that, the countries come up with their own strategies and use that as a basis for their financing requirements. And so that's just launched. It's also meant to bring in a more holistic way the whole aspect of again, inclusion and resource sustainability, and really tries to make the emphasis on the appropriate role of government. It's a hypothesis at this point. I won't claim that this is the project that's going to work. We'll see how it goes. But the enthusiasm is strong, and I just came back from the launch of it with SILS in Nouakchott, Mauritania, and really I was impressed that the messages and the key elements were being said very clearly by all 6 countries and by the Executive Secretary of SILS and others. So I think it's promising. So again, that's helping us to come into this space in a more, I think, more deliberate way. The groundwater, absolutely critical. We're doing some complementary work on helping countries in the Sahel with groundwater assessment, groundwater monitoring, and groundwater governance. In fact, I would have liked to have spent the entire day listening, but at 11 o'clock with our Vice President for Africa, we're having a review of an initial discussion document on groundwater assessment for Africa, and what are the opportunities and the challenges, and how we can support that. So going to that. In terms of going forward from the conference or the forum, a couple of practical things that we're hoping will happen. One is a statement that we sort of drafted ahead of time, given everything that was going on. We didn't have the time to go through a long negotiated process of saying we all sign on to this or not, and an announcement. But I think in conjunction with the Water for Food Institute, which is leading a lot of the events in Brazil at the World Water Forum, we're hoping that perhaps this statement or declaration can become a basis for sort of putting out what is farmer-led irrigation, what does it mean, what are the ways we need to act as supporters of this development, to the best effect in terms of the roles of the public sector, private sector, the financing community, et cetera. And we've heard some real interest from a number of the stakeholders to have something like that available. Again, just as a reference point, not as trying to bind anyone, but again, to help with vocabulary, to help with key principles. A second one is really to try and build more collective action. We talk about collective action a lot with the farmers, but amongst the financing community. And there, I think we're going to really try and start with sort of the like-mindeds that were somewhat involved in this conference, which is, USAID, African Development Bank, IFAD, and ourselves as a starting point to really keep ourselves honest, just as we're looking to the SILS and the Sahel Initiative to help the countries sort of put some peer pressure on each other in terms of how they approach irrigation and share knowledge. We think we have to start with our own house and sort of work amongst ourselves, so that, as is already happening with the last couple of days and today, we're having a chance to learn from each other's experiences and build on those and share approaches. Thirdly is really supporting knowledge exchanges more broadly, whether it's Nebraska or Texas or California vis-a-vis the various countries in Africa or South Asia, or India and Mozambique, et cetera, China. We really want to collectively really support those exchanges, and we had a chance during the conference to really hear what the rich experience is and how relevant it is in terms of common challenges, even if the solutions are obviously going to be very locally specific. And then lastly, in terms of sort of next steps going forward, again, coming off of the discussions with the private sector, really coming up with these new business models, and from 2 dimensions. And again, I'll make reference, Rob's making my job easy because he explained a lot of these issues very nicely. One is, again, this integrated platform sort of approach that they feel they can bring, which includes irrigation technology at the center, because that's the big shifter in what you can do and how you can do it. But also looking at the whole thing of the wash, and we have some work that we're starting now on integrating the wash aspect with irrigation, particularly integrating the solar pumping element. And sort of what are the opportunities there at individual level, at community level. So we very much are thinking along those same lines. My last thing is just saying, what do I think is the biggest challenge going forward? I think it's keeping our focus. we can be in this room and all of us are like-minded people, whether we call it small-scale irrigation or farmer-led. I'm struck by is how quickly people get into this discussion and suddenly they're talking about what they're doing in irrigation. And it becomes very confusing again. Or what they're doing in terms of input supply, in terms of fertilizer. And those are all relevant, but really keeping enough focus, not to exclude those other elements, because it has to be more holistic, but really so that we focus in on the key issues that matter for this. And again, I would really put that emphasis in terms of how we think together on this issue of inclusive supply chains that respect the role of the private sector, and this issue of resource sustainability, because that's where I think at least an organization like the one I work for, which really comes from more of a public interest perspective, that's where we need to add the value, more so than trying to be the ones who are directly getting the work done. But in any case, again, I really want to thank all of you for the chance to be here today, for your participation over the last 2 days, which made it, I think, a rich exchange. This is a nice continuation, and I hope we continue to work together in this way over the next few years so that we're really providing a good offering, a good product out there to the farmers, whether they be in Africa or South Asia or the US, et cetera. So thank you very much.